Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Eric Coleman with IIST and I will be the moderator for today's webinar, Testing as a Second Language, Back to the Basics by Dr. Magda Hannah. We're excited to be able to join us today. Set aside an hour to attend this webinar. This webinar is sponsored by IIST, the leaders in education-based certifications and training. For more information on how IIST can help you or your organization, please visit testinginstitute.com. This webinar is one of a series of free webinars offered by IIST. Be sure to join us for the next webinar in this series, Scaling Agile, SAFe 4.0, and CMMI Deliver Hardened Large-Scale Agile by Tom Cagley on February 24th from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. Central Standard Time. To learn more about this and other webinars in this series, go to testinginstitute.com. You may submit your questions at any time during this webinar in your question box in your GoToWebinar window. Today's presenter will answer as many questions within the time allowed at the end of today's session. This webinar is also being recorded and will be made available for viewing within 48 hours at testinginstitute.com. At the end of today's webinar, you'll be asked to complete a short survey. At IIST, we strive to provide the highest quality educational resources for the public and would appreciate it if you could take a few minutes to complete this short survey. I will now turn the webinar over to today's presenter, Dr. Magda Hannah. Dr. Hannah?
Thank you, Eric. Well, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are joining us from. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Magda Hannah. I am the Chairman, CEO, and founder of the International Institute for Software Testing. If you have not heard me speaking before, or if you have not learned anything from me through the International Institute for Software Testing, I am basically an educator, practitioner who have been teaching people around the world software testing for over 35 years now. And I came up with this idea about testing as a second language, back to the basics. Again, after a while, after I have been teaching people in many organizations, and even with the state of practice in software testing is really getting very advanced now, with all the interesting things from testing DevOps and testing Agile and testing mobile applications to SAFe, the Scaled Agile Foundation, which you're going to see the presentation about next week. Even with all these advances, over the last several months, I still met a number of people who are doing testing who do not really have one way of communication, do not understand the simplest things. So I kind of, this is kind of about like 3-4 months ago, I came to the point, I said, what is wrong? What is going on? Now, please understand, I am not ever generalizing here, because I have met also a lot of people who are very advanced in software testing, who are doing a lot of advanced work, whether it is test automation framework or testing in Agile or DevOps or whatever, or testing Internet of Things. There are people who are doing that, but there are so many people who have not come to a point where they know exactly what they're doing. So I decided to do this, and most likely I'm going to do part 2 and part 3 of this presentation as well, because I have so much material to cover. I used to teach some of this material in the older days when I started the Institute back in 1999. So what I'm going to do with you today is to help all of us understand where we are in software testing and establish a basic language of software testing that we should agree to. So just in case if any one of you is expecting to see something new, because when people hear testing as a second language, they might think that I'm going to introduce you to a new language or something. Well, it might be new to you. So so let's start with few brainstorming questions. Of course, someone says, are we really going to sit here and define what software testing is? Well, guess what? In my courses, in my seminars, when I teach, when I have people in the classroom, people are not even clear in their mind about what is testing, or at least what a test case is. Because I bet if I were to ask the question today, what is a test case? And right now I have about, 75 people joining me. I know people come to join in the very first 5 to 10 minutes. I bet I'll get at least 15, 20 different answers. Okay, why? Because there has not been a standard for us to define what a test case is. Imagine, I mean, this is a great profession. Software testing and quality assurance is a great profession, not any less than any other profession. And the fact that, and I'm going to encourage you to do this today or Monday when you get back to your office, ask people around you in the same organization, what is a test case? How do we define a test case? I bet you're going to find the same people within the same organization having a different view of what is a test case is. It doesn't look very good, because imagine now if you bring 5 or 10 electricians and ask them the question, what is a screwdriver? Okay, or what is the difference between a voltage of 110 versus 220? And you get multiple answers. That would be terrible, right? It would be terrible as well in our profession if we don't have an agreement on a number of things. Not only the terminology and not only the meaning of the terminology, but most importantly on the process that we use to build things. So these are some of the things I hope to share with you today over the hour. But to start with, let me just share with you that I had extracted this material from the 3-day workshop that I teach through the International Institute for Software Testing, and the course is available online if you're interested in much more details, and most importantly, if you are interested in doing hands-on using the methods and techniques I teach. So I'll try to give you the best parts of that course here. Okay, so you don't have to pay the fee to take the course. I'll bring you here some of the best topics in the course. But let's together here think about some questions, okay? I really want everyone to go back and say, how do we come up with test cases? That's of course assuming what a test case is. Do we have a systematic way by which we produce or we derive or we create test cases from whatever we have, whether it is requirement or user stories or user interface or anything else? Do we know how to do this? If you have 2 or 3 or 5 people designing a test, by the way, the word designing a tests, I don't hear it very often. I hear writing a tests. And I hope we all agree that there is a big difference between writing test cases or writing test scripts and designing tests. It's like everything else, by the way. Okay? If you're making modifications to your house, like what I'm doing now, I had to go to an engineer to design the change I am making. Then when the engineer finishes the work, he's going to pass this on to a drafter, a person who would draft the drawings. okay? And there will be interaction between the engineer and the drafter. And guess what? If I'm doing some architectural change to my house, then I'm going to need an architect. All these roles of engineering, drafting, and architecting, all is available in our profession. So really we have to understand what's involved in designing tests versus what's involved in writing tests and test scripts. And if we are looking at the test architecture where it is manual or automation, and interestingly enough that I only hear the term architectures when we're talking about test automation, which is a misconception. Test strategies and test architectures exist, whether you're using a manual testing or automated testing. And you have to go and wonder, what is our testing architecture, even for manual testing effort? Well, I hope if you're doing any automated testing, you have test automation architecture, which includes some frameworks and other things. I'm not going to get into these topics in this presentation. So the question remains, how do you go about writing test cases? How do you come up? I decided to use the word come up here so that I don't get into the definition of designing versus drafting versus architecting. How do we, if you give a requirement or a user story or anything else to 5 testers, do they have one common way by which they can write test cases out of that? I bet if you are a test lead or a test manager attending this presentation, if you go back and do this simple exercise with your testers, you're going to find that every one of them is doing a different thing. Every one of them is following a different methodology or a method, if you will, to come up with test cases. In fact, you will be surprised to see that many testers are not even using any method, any systematic method by which they come up with test cases. I don't know how we can do this. If you put a requirement in front of you, if we bring a requirement and I look at it and you look at it and 5 other people look at it, how can we possibly write test cases for that requirement or for that user story if we do not have a systematic process by which we write those test cases? And that's why there is a big difference between one tester and another. All right? When we have a process or a methodology or a method or whatever you want to call it, then we eliminate the differences between people. Because if we all use the same process and the same methodology, we will certainly come up with results that are close enough. I'm not saying that 5 different people are going to take the same requirement and they're going to produce the same number of test cases. No. But at the very least, you would not have that situation which I sometimes get, no, not sometimes, most of the times I get in my courses when I put a very simple requirement in front of attendees, and I do this very early in the course. I put a very simple requirement in front of attendees, and I ask the simple question, and I say, how many test cases would you write for this requirement? And for the same requirement, I get answers ranging from 3 test cases to 45 test cases. For the same requirement, if I have 20 people sitting in the classroom, that's what I get. Right away, that tells me that those people are not using one common method by which they write test cases. This is the most critical thing we should have. As a test lead or a test manager, I want you to go back and find out if you have this problem or not, and I will be surprised. I would be very surprised if you don't have it. I would be very surprised if you get close enough numbers. I'm not saying the number of test cases by itself is a critical thing. I'm talking about the uniformity of the answer and what people do about it. Okay, so we will address those questions, by the way. But then even if we're going to ask about, how do we produce test cases, do we have an agreement amongst our group and our team about what is a test case? As I said, every one of us will have a different definition. All right, I will address this as well. I think we all have to go and look at these two questions together. If you have the answer, that's great. Every time I asked, and then, by the way, I used to travel around the country to give a free full day seminar. Some of you might have attended that. And I've done this over a number of years. Actually, I started doing the free live seminars around the country back in 1999 when I founded the Institute, and I continue to do it until very recently. The title of some of those webinars were things like the 10 Commandments of Software Testing, if any one of you remember that. And I used to ask the same question. What is a test case? And when I get an answer from a number of people, then I follow up with the question. I says, so what is a test script? And you find most people having the same, they think they are the same. Well, of course, if we don't have that simple language to communicate, we're having a problem already. You know what I found out also? That people do not understand why we test. The most common answers I get when I ask the questions, why are we testing? What are we trying to achieve? As software test and QA professionals, what are we trying to achieve when we test? Because guess what? If our objectives in whatever we do are not clear and crisp, then we will never succeed in what we're doing. Imagine if I were to come to you this morning to teach you this webinar, and I don't have in my mind a clear and crisp objectives that I'm trying to achieve. And you better believe it, I do have it. I know what I'm trying to achieve in this webinar. It's not one thing, it's not two things, it's probably easily 7 to 10 things that I have written them, that I work hard during the 1 hour to achieve them. Do you have the same for your testing effort? If you are a test lead or test manager, do you have that the objectives of your test team well defined? The most common answers I get when I ask these questions is things like, I'm trying to find as many problems as possible, or I'm trying to see if the software works as expected. Now, let me tell you this is probably a fraction of what you're supposed to be achieving when you do testing, right? Unfortunately, in this 1 hour, I'm not getting into setting up the objectives of the test team, or at least setting up the objectives of yourself as a test professional. I might get to it in part 2, which I will be scheduling sometime soon. As I was kind of putting those slides together over the last 3-4 days, I found out that I have so much material to cover in 1 hour, so I thought about the idea that I will do part 2 and possibly part 3. But the question remains, what are our objectives when we do testing? This is always critical, by the way, because as you can imagine, if I come to you today and I have it clear and crisp in my mind what objectives I am trying to achieve, then I will work very hard. All the things I do during the 1 hour will have to help me achieve those objectives. This is not only about testing. This is about anything you do in life. You got to step back and say, do I know my objectives? Do I know what I'm trying to achieve? And guess what? If you don't completely define your objectives, if you just say, for example, I'm trying to make sure the software works as expected, then all the things you do are going to be geared only towards achieving that goal or that objective. So I ask you that you be a little more broader in your objectives. All right. Now, what is this thing called language? I bet some of you were surprised when they saw the title, Testing as a Second Language. When I came to this country, to America, 35 years ago, actually now it's been 36. I came here in 1981. You probably can guess, and some of you were in the same situation. I had to take a course or 2 or 3. I took only 1 course on testing English as a second language. Why are they giving people coming to this country this kind of a course? Because they want people to be able to communicate in that language. A language is the only mean of communication, whether it is a spoken language or not, whether it is technical language or non-technical language, it doesn't matter. If we are members of the same group, of the same community, then we must have a language for ourselves. I don't think I need to convince you with that. All the things that God created have languages to speak in and to communicate with. We, as tester professionals and the QA professionals, very often we don't have a language to communicate. That's why we don't communicate very well. The main reason we need the language is to be able to communicate. So when I sit down here and I say a test scenario, everyone should know what I mean by that. When I sit down, I say test case. Everyone should know what I mean by that. When I sit down and say anything and I form or I compose a sentence that involves some of those vocabularies, then everyone knows what I'm talking about. That's really what we're missing. So in those webinars, I'm going to try hard to establish that language for us. I mean, I have established the language years ago. I just think I want to teach you the language. That's all what I'm going to do. So the language has been established. But I don't think too many of us speak that language. So let's start with the most basic concept in our profession, testing. What does it mean to test? I'm not asking you what is software testing now. I'm saying, what does it mean to test? Because once we know that, then we will know how to write test cases, test scripts, test scenarios, whatever it is that we need to write. Well, I'm not expecting you to answer this question, but let me just answer this question for you step by step. When we test, we have a system, or we have part of the system. And we are looking at this system or part of the system as a black box. Now, I know if I have developers in the room, they may say, no, 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 I don't look at it as a black box. Well, just bear with me, because initially you have to look at it as a black box. And then you start opening that box, if you will, to see more and more of the details inside the box. But in order to simplify the concept of testing, we have to look at things as a black box. Whether it is a system, whether it is a mobile device you are testing, or whether it is an app on the mobile device, whether it is a medical device you're testing, whether it is a functionality in a web-based application, whatever it is, it's a black box. And when you have a black box, you're thinking mostly in giving some input to that box. And people in all other professions do the same. People who are testing some devices that are not even programmed, they apply some input to it. They apply some voltage to it. They run current in it. So the input here in our profession in software testing is data. Any data that's coming from outside the system or the part of the system into the system. That data can come from anywhere you wish. That data can come from a keyboard you're entering the data. That the data can come from another application. The data can come from a file or a database somewhere. It can come from a totally different system. Anything coming from inside the system, from outside the system into the system is data. And because we give that data to the system, then we expect some output. And again, the output is anything coming out of the system or the part of the system we are testing. So if the functionality you're trying to test is writing data to a file, whatever it is writing to a file is output. If it is supposed to display something on the screen, whatever you're displaying on the screen is an output. We have to make it very clear in our mind. What's an output? What's an input? If we don't have that, then we cannot advance in our profession and we cannot communicate. These are elements of the language. So every language has certain elements of it. And that's what I'm trying to define for you. Or at least that's what I'm trying to teach you, what I have defined over the years. Output is very critical, and output can be anything. If your application you're testing, or the system you're testing, or the small functionality you're testing is supposed to send data to another system to work on it, well, that data going to another system is also an output. All right. Well, we all realize that we cannot stop. Testing cannot stop here, because the box is still black box to us. And there's so much stuff going into that box, inside the box, that we don't need. We'll know, sorry, forgive me. So much stuff going inside the box that we don't know. So when we put the input to the system, there is some stuff inside that system. There are some facts, there are some conditions that exist that affects how this system will deal with my input. The simplest example I can give you here is that if I am trying to, my input is trying to cancel an order, all right? To cancel an order, I'm giving you the simplest example here. Then some of the facts that are stored inside the system that will affect how the system will deal with my input are things such as, does the order even exist inside the system? Has this order been shipped or not? Has this order been paid or not? And if it was paid, how was it paid? All these things, guys, are not input. They are conditions that exist in the system. I'm going to call them preconditions. I don't care what you call them. Keep that in mind. I really don't care what you call them. You can call them anything you want as long as you have an agreement with the people within the same community on what we call that thing. Preconditions are everything about the current state of the system. Okay, so if you want to generalize that, if I'm talking about a device, a hardware device, if I'm talking about testing an app on a device, then there is so much stuff about that device. If I want to, for example, test how Google Maps work on a mobile device, then some of those preconditions are whether location is being shared or not. Because if location is not shared, then Google Maps will not be able to work the way it's supposed to work. All right? If I'm testing a medical device, then some of the preconditions would be, you know, which lights are on, which buttons are being pressed, and so on. So I want you to clearly distinguish between preconditions and inputs. By the way, those of you who have taken my courses, especially the course on best practices in software tested planning and design, have already seen that. I'm not sure, however, if they still remember it. I'm not sure if they're practicing it. So now you can see there is a part to the definition that says and/or environment. So the preconditions do not only involve what's in the system, but also they involve everything around the system. And that's why I intentionally made this blue box goes a little bit outside the boundaries of the black box. If we use a black box to represent the system or the part of the system we're testing, then obviously preconditions can be outside that black box. Examples of preconditions that are in the environment, you can imagine. None of our systems and none of our applications work by itself, whether it is mobile or whatever it is. I mean, when we get into testing Internet of Things, you will appreciate what I mean by preconditions that exist in the environment. Because Internet of Things, I mean, of course, this is not the only thing, but just to letting you know how complex it can get when we are testing any functionality of any system or subsystem, that I need to know the preconditions in the environment. In fact, let me tell you this, most of the problems we run into in our systems are because some of the stuff in the environment around the system was not tested. There is something happened in the environment around the system, and it happened in production while the system is in production. And we did not account for that condition while we were doing testing. So in order for us to do effective testing, we have to think about everything in the environment that could possibly affect how my system will deal with input, or how that will affect how my system will work. I mean, in the simplest case, when I'm running an application, I mean, one of the most obvious preconditions that exist in the environment is what browsers I am running this app on, or what operating system I'm running. Of course, we all know that mobile apps act differently between OS and any other operating system. Okay. All right. So preconditions involve anything inside the system or outside the system. Now, when I give an input to the system and there are certain preconditions that I consider, it's not only that the system will give me an output, but the system also will give me new conditions, things that will happen. And those things, again, could possibly happen inside the system or outside the system in the environment. I will call those post conditions. You can call them anything you want, as long as you have an agreement. I mean, I'm explaining to you simply what testing means. I'm not even getting into test cases yet. Anytime you run a test, you've got to consider those 4 pieces. And now it becomes obvious and clear that the input I'm giving to the system, together with what preconditions are there, will work together and will give me some output and will produce some post conditions. So I need to be aware of all the post conditions, that will be produced. Post conditions can be almost anything. Some of those post conditions can be desirable and some of them are not desirable. All right? As I said, they could be inside the system or outside. So when records get updated in the database, that's a post condition. When my system does something that starts or restarts another system or causes another system to do something, that's a post condition. That's outside my system. So in a way, I need to understand the impact and the effect of everything I do in my system. One more time, most of the problems and most of the bug reports we receive from the field and from production are because there are certain things that happen in the environment as a result of input and the preconditions that we didn't think about. As you can see now, testing is not a simple thing. You got to take the time. In order to understand how to design tests, you have to understand those 4 components. At this point, I'm going to just peek into the questions just in case. I don't see any questions. That means that everyone agrees on what I'm saying. Remember, if you have a question anytime, click on the questions tab and write your question, and I will try to answer as many as I can. All right. So based on the understanding of those 4 components, I'm going to give you a simple concept here. A simple concept that I had to remember from the days when I studied chemistry in the older days when I was going to college. I had a degree in petroleum engineering back in 1975. And I worked as a petroleum engineer, petroleum refinery engineer for a couple of years. And my mind had to go back to all the organic chemistry I had to study. And I had to go back to the equations and the concept of an equation in organic chemistry, or all the concept of any equation in mathematics. And you can tell that if you write an equation like this, an input plus preconditions that produce output plus post conditions, or post conditions plus output, the order does not matter here. Something interesting happens, or there are certain rules we know about. And one of the simplest rules about this is that if I change an input, or I change one of the preconditions, some of the things in the right-hand side must change. I might give a different, get a different output, or I may get a post condition that's different from what I got in the first case. Oh, now I can see I used the word case. This is what I call a test case. Now, I know it's kind of weird definition of a test case. Something you have not seen before. None of the hundreds of the books out there in software testing define a test case to be like that. But keep in mind, this definition meets all the rules of engineering and software engineering more specifically. I don't know what you want to call this, by the way. I hope you see this concept to be useful. At this point, if you don't think this concept is useful, I suggest that you don't continue with this webinar. If you think it is useful, then find a name for it. Find a name for it. Is this your test cases? I don't know. Is it your test script? I don't know. Just name it something. For the purpose of my teaching, I call this a test case. In fact, I call it a test case in my practice. This is how I define a test case. Now, again, one more time, please. I told you, I don't care about what you call it. I don't care if you call those things preconditions, post-conditions, input or output. I am just explaining to you the elements of a language and the meaning of those elements. And I'm trying to compose a statement in this language. And I'm trying to tell you what this statement means. If you disagree with the vocabulary of this language, and you disagree with the meaning of the sentence here, then it is up to you. Then you got to find another language to use. I don't care. Okay, so let me see if there are any questions here. Quick. Not sure exactly. If I don't have reaction from audience, then I cannot tell what's going on. I am trying to look at the level of attention in my webinar here. So I hope we're all listening to this. Now, let's move on. If we agree this is what a test case is, or we don't agree. If we agree that this thing in front of you is useful and you give it a name, how are we going to come up with those things? How are we going to take a requirement and come up with those things? If I sit here now and tell you that requirement-based testing does not work, period, are you going to believe me? You know what I mean it does not work? Meaning that what we have been practicing for years, which is taking a requirement or a user story, it does not matter, and building test cases out of that, all what we've been doing is doing it the wrong way. I know, I'm sure some people are going to say, well, if we're not going to design our tests based on requirements, what are we going to do? Well, I'll explain to you in a little bit. Requirement-based testing does not work. So typically, a test professional who deals with requirements in a non-agile project or deals with a user story in an agile project, they take the requirement and they build test cases. Typically, that's what happens. I'm going to tell you that this does not work. Don't do that. Anyone can tell me why? Now, I'm going to have to quiz you to make sure that you are awake with me. Just share with me on the questions tab. Why do you think I'm putting this big red X here? Why should not we do that? Any idea? I hope some of you have answers to that question. So please go ahead. Share something with me. Why is it that I'm claiming that writing test cases based on requirements does not work? I'm waiting for some input here. Quite a bit. Very interesting, by the way. I got someone saying here, since your definition of a test case is the one adopted by the IEEE, guess what? Then I would be surprised that no textbook uses this definition. Yvonne, I can sit here right here and tell you that IEEE does not adopt this definition. This is not the definition that the IEEE uses. This is not. Okay, I wish I remember what the definition from the IEEE is, and the reason I don't remember is because, honestly speaking, I don't care about it. So the IEEE does not define test case the way I defined it. I'm not sure where you came up with the idea that this definition is the one adopted by IEEE. Okay? Although I can see you're saying that you agree that most textbooks do not use this definition. Well, thank you, Brenda. All right. So got some ideas here. When I ask the questions why requirement-based testing is not working, some people say because it's not considering input and output. No. Someone says since the developers use the requirements to build the solution, I use the requirements to test the solution. Well, guess what, Scott? I'm just letting you know that don't do that. So I guess my question is why you think I'm claiming that it doesn't work. I'll tell you in a little bit. Okay, someone else says, Romero says, requirements change often. You are missing preconditions. I like the first part of your answer. Requirements change very often. And there's more into that. Let me see if someone else provided. Of course, Lori, thank you. Lori is anxious to hear why. Okay, using requirements or user stories do not take into consideration the preconditions. Yeah, a couple of people say it does not take into consideration the preconditions, and that's part of the answer. Yes, requirements are unknown or incomplete. I like the part of incomplete, Karen. Yes, requirements are not 100% unknown. We know part of the requirements, as you probably can think, because hopefully developers before they build, in order to build the system, they know some requirements. But the truth is, as you said, requirements are incomplete. A lot of people provided answers here. The requirements do not always specify all of the specifications. Thank you, Jeremy. So to sum all those answers together, in order for us to use the requirement as the basis, or the user story, by the way, as the basis to test, A requirement has to satisfy 5 essential conditions or 5 essential criteria. And those are: the requirement must be understandable, which is sometimes easy to satisfy. Yes, most of us, if you look at the requirement and read it, you can understand it. A requirement must be complete, which is a criteria that's rarely satisfied. No requirement on earth, including the requirements I write myself, is complete. All requirements are missing details. And if we test based on the requirements, then we are not testing for the missing details. And those missing details are some of you said, like missing preconditions. So because requirements are incomplete, requirements are very often, of course, in order to test based on requirement, requirement also have to be unambiguous. Unambiguous meaning that it does not take multiple interpretation. And let me tell you that many requirements we write are very ambiguous. You know that, you've seen them. So because of that, so the 5 criteria is understanding, complete, unambiguous, correct, and consistent. I don't have the time in this webinar because I only have about 8 minutes left. I don't have the time to define each one of those. But let me tell you this. Every requirement that has been written by anyone, including myself, does not meet at least 3 or 4 of those criteria. So requirements are bad. I know I might have requirement writers and requirement engineers with me today, and please don't feel offended when I say requirements are bad. I'm going to even go further and say the state of practice in writing a requirement is terrible, terrible. So we can't rely on requirements. Just to write the test cases. With the same token, developers take the requirements, as we heard from some of you, they take the requirements to design the solution and to code the solution. Well, of course, for the same reasons, I'm asking developers not to do that. All right. So what do we do? In fact, if some of you are working on Agile project and say, oh, we don't use requirements. Well, are user stories any different from this? No. In fact, I am going to go further and say user stories are even far worse than requirements. Why? Because they're brief. At least requirements have some details. User stories don't. Even if some people say, oh, we take a huge requirement and break it down into user stories. But the nature of user stories and the way we write them, they are very brief. If I think, for example, just in terms of completeness, if I think that requirements are 90% incomplete, I'm going to have to say user stories are far more than that incomplete. You cannot rely on user stories to write test cases. So what do we do? Here's what I'm going to give you just as a teaser. And this is what I've been teaching people for the last, 25 years now. So you take a requirement or a user story and you build scenarios, lots of scenarios. And then you write your test cases based on those scenarios. So anyone can say, okay, so what are the scenarios? Or any situation or any condition that could possibly happen in production such that the system needs to react to it. Anything. Of course, we're gonna have to cover this in much more details in future webinars, and I will have to schedule part 2 of this webinar. All right. So you take a requirement or a user stories. It doesn't matter. For me, it doesn't. For me, a user story is a small part of a requirement. Okay. So yes, if you have a large requirements, the Agile team takes it, break it down into a number of user stories. So we'll take a requirement registry and build a bunch of scenarios. As we're going to see in future webinars with the same title, those scenarios can be normal scenarios, things that we are happy for them to happen, and other scenarios are not normal scenarios. I take the approach to call all the normal scenarios, I call them positive scenarios, and I take all the other things, the abnormal, the unexpected, the scenarios that we don't think it will happen, I call them negative scenarios, and I'll speak about positive versus negative scenarios in the future. Scenarios has a lot of details. So the only thing I'm telling you here, honestly, and some of you might say, oh, we already do that. Well, I hope you do, but let's wait until next time I do the webinar. Please watch for part 2 of this webinar. Let's make sure that we really build. If we don't do a good job in building scenarios, guess what? Guess what? We did not go much further, because we're going to rely on those scenarios to write the test cases. Okay? Keep in mind, so far I have not even spoken about test scripts. Okay? I have not spoken about test scripts. That's going to come later on. I think because of the time, and I have only 3 minutes left, I want to stop at this. I've got a number of slides there, but I didn't know if, you know, I realized that I'm going to probably stop at this. This is about the time, the right amount of material that I planned to cover in 1 hour. Okay, so, and I will continue this. Let me, before I close, see if there are any questions that I need to answer. Okay, okay. Let me go at the end here. Brenda, not Brenda, okay. Scott, say, yes, I can see you're saying I use positive and negative tests, but I think in future webinar we need to talk about how do we come up with positive and negative tests. Diana says, so do you build a test case for every scenario you come up with? Good question, Diana. I build lots of test cases for every scenario. If there is a scenario, and again, you will appreciate what I'm talking about here when you really understand what I mean by scenario, because we're talking about the language here, Diana, that I'm not sure, I don't know yet if when you say scenario, you mean the same thing I mean when I say scenario. So when you see what I mean, of course, I gave you the definition that I use for a scenario, which is everything that could possibly happen in production. So to answer your question, do I write a test case for every scenario? And the answer is no. I write multiple test cases for every scenario. So every scenario must be covered. So instead of using the term requirement coverage, I use the term scenario coverage. So I come up with scenarios and I make sure that every scenario is covered by a number of test cases. Right, how do you derive to this level in a fast-paced agile environment? Good question. Again, I use scenarios in agile and non-agile, and I have a full course on building scenarios for non-agile projects. I will try to address your question because we all understand that in agile projects things are very fast-paced, and we cannot just take our sweet time to do things. So I will address this next time. All right. Anything else? Oh, Yvonne, no, I did not take you wrong. I know you agree. I know you agree with the definition. You agree that this definition, you agree with it. I was just commenting on what you said about the IEEE, the fact that IEEE did not use this definition, and as a result, no other books use the definition. The only time people have seen this definition is when they took my courses. Mohammed, you say, can you send this presentation? As Eric said in the beginning, this webinar is being recorded and will be available online at the iist.org at the bottom of the slide here. The website for International Institute for Software Testing is either iist.org or testinginstitute.com. Either one is fine. So it will be available there. I need to close here because Eric wanting to me to close the session. We're done. Hopefully we'll see you or hear from you in future webinars. Please watch for the next webinar on the subject, but also mark your calendar for next Friday for the seminar on Scale the Agile. Thank you all for being with me today. Thanks for your feedback. This really encourages me to continue to do part 2 and part 3, and we'll make it a sequence of webinars. All right. Thank you all. Eric?
Thank you, Dr. Hannah, for your time today, and I want to thank everyone for joining us for today's free webinar sponsored by IIST, the leaders in education-based certifications and training. For more information on how IIST can help you or your organization, please visit testinginstitute.com. You can follow IIST on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube to find out more information about IIST news, events, and promotions. Thank you all again for joining us today, and have a great day. Thank you, Dr. Hannah.
Thank you.